Atlanta Journal-Constitution Community Conversation. Today we'll talk about one of the more important developments we saw in the November 30 election, the role of the suburbs beyond Atlanta and throughout the rest of Georgia. In the presidential race, Democrat Joe Biden tapped the suburbs of Atlanta to carry him to a more than 13,000 vote victory over Republican incumbent Donald Trump. The vote is currently in a recount, and we'll get to that in a bit, of course. Atlanta suburbanites kept Lucy McGrath, a Democrat, in her 6th district seat. Those suburban voters, though, sent another Democrat, Carolyn Bordeaux, to Washington. Georgia's U.S. House delegation now has 4 women. That's a record. And yet most Republican state lawmakers in the Atlanta suburbs were able to hang on to their seats. One reason? More moderate Republicans were allowed to push through legislation that appealed to the group they need most, white, college-educated women voters. Finally, we saw significant power shifts in 2 counties whose economic vibrancy is crucial to our state. The leaders of Cobb and Gwinnett counties are currently white and Republican. In January, they'll be black and Democratic. All these developments have implications for the January 5 runoff for the 2 U.S. Senate seats and for the 2 sessions of the General Assembly that are waiting for us in 2021. We'll get to all of that this evening, and you'll want to stick with us till the end of this event because we have a very special and newsworthy announcement. But first, we offer this event today as a public service, and we owe a special thanks to our subscribers. Because of your support, we were able to make this subscriber benefit open to everyone in our community. As you'll see tonight in conversations with our journalists, it's worth knowing what's really going on. We'll take your questions in social media, so start thinking about those questions and typing them in now, and we'll get to them and answer them later in the show. And an important reminder, if you aren't registered to vote yet, you can still do so and vote in the Georgia Senate runoffs. Those runoffs are January 5th. You have until December 7th to register. Okay, it's time to meet our Atlanta Journal-Constitution journalists who'll be talking with us tonight. First, Jim Galloway, our political columnist. Welcome, Jim. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Next, Greg Bluestein, who's covering the Senate runoffs. Greg, good to see you as well.
Good to see you in person.
Patricia Murphy, who's also assigned to those Senate races. Patricia, good to have you.
Thank you.
Tia Mitchell, our Washington correspondent, who's joining us from Washington. Tia.
Hey.
And finally, Mark Nisi, who covers voting and the election for us. So, Mark, we're gonna start with you because there's plenty of news. Update our audience on the election, the recount, the audit, all that's been going on here in the commotion that is centered in Georgia.
Well, the recount and audit is almost done. Most counties have already completed their portion of this manual recount, which is going through all 5 million ballots cast in the presidential race, and it has to be finished by midnight tomorrow, or technically 11:59 p.m. tomorrow. And then we'll finally find out how close the original results were to the results that we saw on election night. And new votes are already being found. In Fayette County and Floyd counties, each of those audit processes discovered that either memory cards weren't loaded or absentee ballots weren't initially scanned. And so that has closed the margin a little bit. It's now a little bit less than 13,000 votes that Joe Biden is ahead of Donald Trump in Georgia. But election officials say that it's very likely that Joe Biden's lead will hold up, that most counties that have reported election results so far as a result of the recount have been pretty consistent with what we saw on election night. So our our Secretary of State's office, as well as our county election officials, say that the recount is doing what it's supposed to be doing. It is finding votes where they weren't counted, but also showing that in most cases that vote counts are lining up to what was reported previously. And we'll find out more when the recount and audit is done after tomorrow.
So, Mark, there were a lot of questions about the amount of work it would take to do the audit and well, I guess technically it's an audit, so I'll refer to it that way. But there were a lot of questions about whether all these counties could get it done in such a short time. And it sounds like what you're saying is that has not been an issue.
The county election offices have really done a pretty good job, as far as I can tell, in moving through these 5 million ballots. They've moved much more quickly than I expected, and we saw places like Fulton and Gwinnett in particular bring in hundreds of people to count ballots one at a time by hand. They only have to look at the presidential race because that's the only one they're auditing, but they just turn the page and they have two people sitting at a table, and the first person looks at the ballot and says either Trump or Biden, and the second person confirms it, and then they put it in piles. And so it has been a much more quick process than I thought it would be. Most counties worked through the weekend and got a large portion of the work done. Now, that's not to say it isn't a lot of work, and it is going to come with some expense to county taxpayers. We don't know how much it will ultimately cost, but DeKalb County alone estimated it would cost about $180,000.
Mark, you've been covering voting and this issue and our Secretary of State for some time now. I mean, he has, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger has faced just some withering criticism from people in his own party. What's his mood? What does he have to say to you today?
Well, he is trying to present himself as a objective election official who isn't favoring one side or the other. He acknowledges that he is a conservative Republican, but at the same time, he says that his job is to count and report on the vote counts of the results. So he's in a difficult spot where members of his own party, from U.S. Representative Doug Collins, U.S. Senator Kelly Loeffler, U.S. Senator David Perdue, the chairman of the Georgia Republican Party, have all criticized his handling of the election. But just today, we heard him say, there were over 20,000 Republican voters in the primary who didn't vote at all in the general election. And so, he's saying, look, if voters had shown up and maybe they were discouraged by the president's dismissal of absentee voting, for example. That's one possible theory for why they didn't come out. But he is in a difficult spot of trying to be an elections administrator and at the same time a Republican who's going to be up for re-election in 2 years.
Thanks, Mark, for all those insights. We'll be, I think we'll be talking to you a little bit more as we go on with our event and talk a little bit about what's going on in the legislature. But I'm here at our office with Jim Galloway and Greg Bluestein in person. So, Jim, I'm going to come to you next. So the suburbs went to a Democrat. Tell us, please, how did this happen?
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, we are at an anniversary. We are at the 40th anniversary of the suburbs of Atlanta entering into the Georgia political scene. Let me take you back to 1980 when longtime Senator Herman Talmadge, a Democrat, faced Republican Matt Mattingly, just a nobody. Herman Talmadge went to bed thinking he had won another 6-year term. He woke up 25,000 votes short because Matt Mattingly had won Gwinnett and Cobb counties. Those counties had gone Republican. And it was a seminal moment in Georgia politics. Now, Democrats were able to hang on for another 20 years after that. And then the next key moment was 2001 when Governor Roy Barnes, a Democrat, he organized the effort to take down the 1956 state flag that had that huge Confederate battle emblem on it. It was a relic of the 56 fight over segregation. In any case, so the flag came down. and you had a stampede of white rural Republican voters into the Republican hold. Democrats had lived off an alliance of black urban voters and white rural white rural Democrats. All right, so that the taking down the flag was there. There were other issues, but that was a primary one, and it just started the stampede into the Republican arms, and since then, until yesterday, really, well, until 2018, really, Republicans had dominated Georgia by a new alliance of suburban voters and rural white voters. Okay, that then comes Donald Trump. All right, and he changes the equation. All right, we had so in 2018. Lucy McBath defeated Karen Handel in the race for the 6th District Congressional District. That was a big sign. That was a huge sign. And obviously she kept that seat this year. I said Trump is moving is part of the motivation for this. What we're also seeing is this huge divide in Georgia and the rest of the country between college educated voters and non-college educated voters. Non-college educated voters are headed toward the Republican Party. Those with some college education are drifting over to Democrats, including women. So education is another factor. The other thing you have to remember is that 1980 is not 2020, and the suburbs of Atlanta aren't like your granddaddy's suburbs. The figure's a little bit old, but almost 90% of African Americans who live in Atlanta live in the suburbs. They are diverse. They've added 1 million voters just in the last 2 years alone. Those voters are younger, and they are more diverse. They're far fewer white voters.
Jim, let me just follow up on something that you said. So you mentioned that Georgia is an example of what's going on in the country. I mean, we've got so much going on that, voted for a Democratic president, all these things. But I mean, talk about how well does Georgia represent what's going on politically in the country in your mind? Well,
look at it this way. Up in Georgia's northwest corner, in the 14th district, we have Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is a QAnon theorist. She is a Donald Trump loyalist, and you drive down 75, maybe 90 minutes, no more, and you are in pure Biden territory right there. That's new and that's different. And then if you keep driving down to Chatham County and Savannah, you will find another a growing pocket of Democratic votes in the suburbs there, and in Augusta. It's actually a very interesting demographic shift here.
Is it such a sea change that Democrats have talked about it like it was inevitable for some time. They talked about it like it was inevitable a little too soon for a number of years as well. But what do you think? This is a 20-year trend, or this is how it's going to be in 20 years, or what could change it?
I think what we learned on November 3rd was that demography is not destiny. That there are things that Republicans can do to blunt the wave, and there are adjustments that Democrats are going to have to do. Look, you have rising populations of Asians and Hispanics especially in Gwinnett, and these people are out to make the American dream. And to make the American dream, you have to have job security. You have to have a vibrant economy, and those are things that Republicans score pretty well on.
Mm-hmm. Well, while we're talking about the suburbs, I'm going to shift the conversation to these Senate runoff races. And I'm here with Greg Bluestein, who's with us, and he's covering this along with Patricia Murphy. So I'm going to go ahead and get to Patricia first. As you listen to Jim, Patricia, how do you see this playing out in the Senate races?
Well, I think what we know about these Senate races is that they are not going to be just a replay of what we saw in November. Once it became very clear that the future of the U.S. Senate, power in the U.S. Senate, has come down to these two Senate races, I think we know that we're going to see a very different dynamic. And while in the November races, there certainly was a battle for those suburbs, for those, especially those educated women in Cobb County and Gwinnett County, the race in January, we know, is going to be all about the bases of each party. Both parties are going to try not only to get their voters who they know that they can rely on, they've got to get them back out to the polls in January, even without Donald Trump on the ticket. And that means that Donald Trump, or people who are Trump supporters who came out to vote for him in November as Republicans, aren't going to have that reason there anymore. And anybody who is going out to vote against Donald Trump and might have pulled the ticket for those Democratic Senate candidates, they're not going to have Trump vote against anymore. So these campaigns are having to really remotivate their base and give them new reasons to get out in a very different election. There's going to be an enormous amount of time, manpower, energy spent on these elections. And what we're not hearing about a lot are moderate voters. We're not hearing about independent swing voters. We are hearing issues that will really activate and motivate the Democratic base and the Republican base. They want any voter they can get, but I think they feel the most reliable and the best bet are their bases, and those are the messages that we're hearing so far.
So, Greg, I mean, the recent history, or I guess history period, it's very clear that Republicans win runoffs in Georgia. So, is there any reason to believe that won't happen again? I mean, what are you seeing in the campaign from the Republicans and the Democrats?
Yeah, you're right. Republicans have won every statewide runoff in Georgia history dating back to 92. And most recently, 2018, when you saw a whiter and older electorate that tends to favor Republicans show up and help elect Brad Raffensperger to the Secretary of State office. The difference this year is going to be all about what Patricia was just mentioning, which is the base energy, the base excitement, because we've never seen a runoff like this in Georgia history. We've had very competitive runoffs, but we've never seen one that will literally decide control of the U.S. Senate like this one. And so what happened in 2018 is not only did you have a whiter, older electorate show up, you also started seeing some of that support, the Democratic support in the suburbs tailor off a little bit. More Republicans from suburban areas showed up to vote, helped Brad Raffensperger win by a 4 or 5 point margin over John Barrow, the Democrat in that race. This time around, Democrats are going to try to hold their numbers in the suburbs. They were approaching 60% of support in Gwinnett County. If they can get anywhere close to that, they're in good shape. And I know that we're talking a lot about the suburbs here, but the exurbs, Paulding County, Forsyth County, Cherokee County, are more important than ever for Republicans. Those are the areas where they need to build up huge margins. And also the areas where Joe Biden would manage to undercut their Republican support. I'll take Forsyth County. That was the home of the first debut appearance from David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler in this runoff cycle just this past Friday. They went there for a reason. Trump won that county by 71% of the vote in a huge amount. In 2016, he carried it by about 2/3, but 4 or 5 points less just this month. So they're trying to run up their margins, the exurbs, to try to offset Democratic gains in Atlanta suburbs.
Jim, Greg and Patricia both mentioned Trump. So, I mean, in your analysis of the politics in this state, I mean, there was so much talk about people motivated to vote for or against him and turned out. But what does he mean to the Senate race based on what's going on in the state?
2 points. First of all, this runoff will be different from the 2018 one in that it won't be in December. It will be in January. It's a 9-week lead time, which gives both parties more time to organize and get those people out. The 2018 race was first week in December, as have all previous runoffs. That's been when we've had all previous runoffs. Now, as for Trump, okay, I would focus on David Perdue. David Perdue, his strategy all along was to run just a few points higher than Donald Trump in Georgia, predicting that Donald Trump would carry the state as well. Okay, and he did. He finished a little bit ahead, not far enough though to avoid the runoff. Okay, so he's in a position where he and Loeffler have they've gone after Brad Raffensperger and challenged the integrity of the election. He has really gone. He's become very dependent on the Republican base. Now the question is, funny thing about Brad Raffensperger, He lives in Johns Creek in North Fulton. All right. So if you're David Perdue and if you're dependent on the suburban vote, what happens to Raffensperger Republicans? Do they swallow what Perdue has done, or do they hang with Democrats on the in the runoff? It's a really interesting question.
So, I mean, Greg, does a runoff? I mean, what is the Purdue camp saying about the Trump thing? They're solid with him. They're not running from
It's
Trump.
a very uncomfortable position for the Republicans right now to be in, because you're not hearing them concede. They're echoing President Trump. You're not hearing them say President-elect Biden. They're not conceding the fact that Joe Biden won this election and won the state of Georgia. And they're doing that for a couple of reasons. One is to continue to energize their base. And to give their base a reason to still pay attention to this race in 7 more weeks when we finally have the vote. But the second is they don't want to alienate President Trump because he is still on Twitter saying falsely that he was elected president. And so they're worried that if they somehow alienate President Trump in this race, then President Trump will send the message to his voters, to his supporters, I should say, his loyal supporters, not to bother with this election. And that's the worst nightmare for these two Republicans, because they need every supporter they can get to turn back out, because it could be and it should be a very, very close race.
Tia Mitchell in Washington. So as we mentioned earlier, there'll be 5 women from Georgia joining you in Washington, which is a record. And you've been covering Lucy McBath in this race in the 6th district, where she held off Karen Handel, who she beat for that seat in the first place. What's your take on why McBath was able to keep that seat in the 6th?
In the 6th, it was twofold. First of all, Lucy McBath has had 2 years to establish herself as the incumbent. And she's been a pretty active congresswoman, holding town halls, doing things even virtually during the pandemic to try to reach her constituents in the district. And I think a lot of constituents in the 6th district thought she had been doing a pretty good job. And then we can't discount, again, we talked about suburban Atlanta and how the demographics are changing to favor Democrats even more. And so, all along, Lucy McBath was considered the front runner. We knew that Karen Handel would give her a run for her money because Karen Handel has held the seat before. And until recently, that seat had been held by Republicans, but the demographics are showing us that Cobb County, like all the other Atlanta suburbs, is pretty blue.
And how about, shifting over to the 7th district? I mean, Carolyn Bordeaux came very close last time, but got over the top this time. Are those districts are not exactly the same, right? They're very different, actually.
Yes, Gwinnett County has a lot more. Of course, the Asian population is very big in Gwinnett County. The Latino population is very big in Gwinnett County, as well as still having a sizable Black and white population. So Gwinnett is very diverse, a lot of immigrants in Gwinnett County, more so than some of the other suburban Atlanta counties. And again, if anything, in 2018, it showed us that Rob Woodall was able to hold on, in part because he had the power of the incumbency. And even then, as the incumbent, he was only able to win by fewer than 500 votes. And so once he decided he was going to leave the seat, not run for office again, that 7th district again was going to favor the Democratic candidate. And Carolyn Bordeaux, she wasn't the incumbent, but she had the name recognition that came from running in 2018. She was able to keep her campaign apparatus pretty much active for 2 years after that race. And she was able to win that seat.
So Marjorie Taylor Greene, Georgia's QAnon congresswoman. Talk about that and how her election plays in suburbia and plays for the future of Republicans in Georgia.
Well, so Marjorie Taylor Greene, who represents Northwest Georgia, I think that her district is considered rural Georgia. And so I think in suburbia, even Republican voters might not have chosen a candidate like Marjorie Taylor Greene if she had, initially she was going to run in the Republican primary against Karen Handel in the 6th district. And I think she could have perhaps won that Republican primary by, touting her Trump loyalty and catering to that far right base. But it would have been really hard for Marjorie Taylor Greene. If Karen Handel couldn't have beat Lucy McBath, then I don't think Marjorie Taylor Greene could have either. But in a more rural district, a much redder district, Marjorie Taylor Greene was successful. And I think the question is now, what type of Congresswoman is she going to be? Right now, we know that she'll go on social media, she'll spread conspiracy theories, she'll spread misinformation, she'll parrot some of the things that Donald Trump says, even if they're not true. But that's not what makes a good member of Congress. And her constituents still are going to be looking for services and resources from that office. And the question is, how does she handle those duties beyond just kind of the social media far right star that she is?
And how, all these women, record number of women from Georgia headed to Congress. How do you see the significance of that?
I think it is significant. And quite frankly, that is significant for both parties. Republican women were very successful this campaign cycle. And then we know that Democrats have historically been more progressive than Republicans in electing women. But again, this cycle, Republican women were very successful. And I think it shows that, generally speaking, women are starting to harness their political power, and voters are starting to want more diversity, not just color of your skin, but women, LGBTQ. We want our representatives to kind of represent America, and just having mostly men or mostly white people isn't really representative of what America looks like. So it's interesting, until recently, we never had more than one woman in Georgia's congressional delegation. And then we celebrated that there were 2. Now there are 5, but that's out of 16 people. And we know that, so that's what, like a third, but women make up half the population of Georgia. So it still isn't representative, even though there's a record number.
Thanks, Tia. I'll remind our viewers too that I'm asking all the questions now of these folks, but you can submit your questions on whatever social media platform you're using to view this, and we will be getting to them shortly. Next, we're going to bring Mark Nisi back in to talk a little bit about the impact of suburbia on the legislature, which has been different than it has been on some of these national races. Mark, and how has it been different, and why?
It's so interesting. We saw Georgia change on the presidential level, where unofficial numbers show that Biden is ahead of Trump and will likely carry Georgia. But on the legislative level, you didn't see that kind of change in how Georgia voters decided on their local legislative candidates. The Democrats needed 16 to pick up 16 seats to gain a majority. They got 2 in the state house. So they fell far short of the blue wave that they were hoping for to gain control in the Georgia House of Representatives. Democrats also lost their minority leader, Bob Trammell, who lost his race in Luthersville. But we also did see some Republican losses. We saw Brett Harrell out of Snellville, Deborah Silcox in Fulton County, Sandy Springs area, Dale Rutledge, and McDonough. They all lost to Democratic opponents in the Senate. PK Martin, representing Lawrenceville, appears to have lost as well. So there were small changes, but not anything like what the Democrats were thinking they were going to achieve. And that's important because we know 2021, after the census, is going to be when redistricting happens. That's when new maps are drawn for the state. And with Republicans in charge of the state house and state senate and the governor's office, they will be able to draw these districts with the majorities they have to help their candidates stay in office for the next 10 years.
Okay. Jim Galloway, I want to come back to that redistricting question. But before we do that, in the introduction, I mentioned that the more moderate Republicans were allowed to pass legislation that appealed to the voters they needed, which were college-educated suburban women. I think you can fill in maybe a little better what that exactly means.
That meant that you had the backing of House Speaker David Ralston on a number of these things. And Ralston was in favor of keeping his majority and keeping his job as Speaker. And he knew that keeping caucus numbers up was part of that. And to keep caucus numbers up, you had to have Republican members from suburbia. We saw it this summer in this long drawn out session that was kind of delayed by COVID. You saw Republicans back for the first time, really a substantive hate crimes bill. Passed the legislature, and it passed it was signed by the governor. It was sponsored by Chuck Estration out of Decula in Gwinnett County. And I believe he survived.
He did.
Did he not?
He did.
You saw Sharon Cooper in Marietta, a very, very competitive district in Cobb County. She had an effort to address Georgia's just terrible maternal mortality rates.
She was also behind the bill that reformed senior care homes, which is a big part of our investigation.
Exactly. And both of those issues appealed to women very, very much, and she survived. It's going to be very interesting to see how this plays out next year as well, because it's once you go in that direction, it's going to be hard to go in another, except for the fact that now, and this just has come up in the last couple of days, you're going to have a fight over absentee ballots in the legislature. And it's going to be interesting to see how suburbia reacts to that.
We'll talk about how that fight sets up.
All right. You have Barry Fleming. He is a state representative out of Harlem, just in the neighborhood of Augusta. And he is the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee. So when Barry Fleming speaks, people tend to listen. And he pointed out that he is among those Republicans calling absentee ballots as suspect, nefarious, and ripe for corruption. And he wants the legislature to tackle that. Now, if you are in the burbs and if you are a woman voter concerned with health, or a male voter concerned with health, if you have elderly parents, if you have kids who want to go to public school, and so you know that your community must stay COVID free, well, that's going to be a concern if you're going to gut Georgia's absentee ballot law.
Mm-hmm. Greg, a question for you. We talked about the direction David Ralston led the House as Speaker, but it looks a little bit like the Lieutenant Governor who leads the Senate, Jeff Duncan, has nudged in a different direction lately too with all that's gone on. What's your take on the Lieutenant Governor?
Yeah, it was really interesting, especially doing that hate crimes legislation that Jim just spoke about, because at first the Senate had a very different approach to that hate crimes. They wanted a much less expansive version of the law that also wrote in some protections for law enforcement officers that enraged many Democrats. It's more of the Senate, which is also Republican controlled, of course, remains more conservative. There's less of a chance of Democrats making a big play to switch the chamber in the next decade, really. Whereas the House, you had these suburban trends that reshaped, especially the northern arc, but also the southern arc as well, that really put Republicans on the defensive. And if you go back to what Jim was saying, if you compare these last round of votes that you had during the end of the session to 2019, when Republicans barely passed the anti-abortion heartbeat bill, and there was tears on the floor of the House. There was Republican incumbents who privately thought that they were done, that their careers were over because of that bill, even if they supported it, because it was so controversial and divisive. And then compared to the end, when they were passing more broad-based, consensus issues that got a broad majority of the legislative chambers to support them. It shows you how quickly the strategy's changed. And what one of those imperiled Republican incumbents, Burt Reeves, who represents an area of Cobb County, what he told me was basically there was two races. There was the race for president and there was a race for everything else. That helps explain how all these Republican down ticket candidates, although Mark mentioned there was a few flips for Democrats, it wasn't nearly the sort of down ticket carnage that Democrats were hoping for with what they thought would be a blue wave. As Speaker Ralston said, it ended up being, in his view, more of a squirt gun than a tidal wave.
Patricia Murphy, we've had several mentions of the Republicans now controlling, drawing the lines for districts throughout the state. I mean, how far can they push that, and can they maintain control despite these trends over time?
Well, I think that in politics, you always see what seems like a pendulum. The pendulum swings to the left and the pendulum swings to the right. Certainly that has happened in Georgia now. We all remember when it swung from the Democrats, one party state, all the way over to the Republicans. I feel like redistricting, when you decide who is going to be in charge of the legislature during redistricting, it's a way for that party to hold the pendulum in place for a little bit longer. It won't stop the demographic trends. It also won't change who they nominate for president in the future. It won't change the choices that they're making necessarily. It won't change those internecine party battles that we're seeing from the Republicans. But I think when you know who's going to be in charge for redistricting, and it will be the Republicans, I think it's going to slow those trends, especially at the legislative level. They'll be able to redraw it so that at least you can't stop the wave, but you can build a wall of your own making for a little bit longer to hold it off.
Okay, we're getting, I think, a little tight on time. And so I want to get into this changes in Cobb and Gwinnett County. And I mean, I think anyone who wants to can jump in here, but it certainly is a big change, Jim. We suddenly have county leadership that's going to look different than it's looked for probably as long as you've been here.
Very, very different, and it's part of the trend. You have, I think, I'd say 9 of 11 major Metro Atlanta counties now led by people of color, and these transitions can sometimes be difficult. We always cite DeKalb County and Clayton County as examples of that when you have wholesale replacements of the bureaucracy and the leadership in very short order. I think what we're going to see in Gwinnett and Cobb is something a little bit more different and a little bit more gradual. If you take a look at Gwinnett is majority minority demographically. There is no racial group or ethnic group that has a majority in Gwinnett County. And so there's not that, I don't think there's going to be that push to alter the bureaucracy, which could really affect how you get your services. I mean, local government is a very practical creature here. All right. The situation is also different in Cobb. Yes, Lisa Cupid was elected Cobb County Commission chair, defeating Republican Mike Boyce. But Cobb County is still 70% white. 30%, roughly 30% black. There is going to have to be quite a bit of coalition building, a biracial or multi-racial coalition building in both Cobb and Gwinnett, and that's not unlike the city of Atlanta politics, which is rapidly becoming a city where no one has the majority.
Tia, you covered DeKalb County before we to go to Washington for us. And I think, a big part of what you covered was the struggles that the leadership in that county was dealing with. I mean, what would you say we ought to be as Metro Atlantans paying attention to as these counties make this transition?
Well, DeKalb County has a very unique structure of government with its elected CEO that acts somewhat like a strong mayor system. And so, of course, these newly changing over counties, Gwinnett and Cobb, don't have the same structure. But I think still the core is the leadership of the county. And if leadership not only kind of keeps the continuity and can keep doing what they're doing well, but also that leadership can hold the confidence of the electorate. That's what DeKalb struggled with, is that often its leaders failed to live up to the trust that voters had put in those leaders, and had a lot of failures in leadership in DeKalb. And DeKalb is doing well now under CEO Thurman, which shows what happens when you do have a strong leader in place who earns the trust and the respect of voters. And so I think that's what's going to be important, particularly in Gwinnett and Cobb, not just with the leadership of the county commission, but we talked a lot about policing this year, and they both have new leaders at the sheriff's office as well. And I think that's going to be very important too.
Okay, I think we're going to go to our viewer questions at this point. We've had such a great conversation. I've lost a little bit of track of time, so we're going to get in as many of those questions. Stick with us because we do have a really big announcement coming here before we finish up. So Leroy Chapman has been monitoring those questions, and Leroy, I'll let you ask what you think should be the first question from our viewers.
Thank you, Kevin, and hello. So we have been looking at questions from our subscribers and our audience at large. And here's the first question. There's a lot of interest in the shift, of course, of the suburbs from blue to red. So the first question is from Cobb County. We have a subscriber there who wants to know which county is next. He's watched Cobb County go from red to blue, and he's interested in which county is probably next probably will turn from blue to red.
Well, if I had to guess on that one, I would urge people to keep an eye on Cherokee County and possibly Paulding. Those are both bedroom communities essentially, but there was a serious uptick in Democratic voting in both of those counties that I know Republicans are going to be worried about.
And I'm watching Fayette County. I'm looking up the numbers at Fayette right now, but it was about 5,000 votes divided President Trump and Joe Biden in Fayette County.
And that's incredibly small.
Yeah, it's very slim margins. So it is still a red county, but right on the edge right there.
Okay. Well, we have another question from subscribers. It's about the same topic. So we've got one from a subscriber in Lone Oak out in Meriwether County. And this subscriber would like to know, how far from the Atlanta suburbs might this Democratic shift go? So how far from the Atlanta suburbs might this shift wind up going?
I'll throw that to you, Patricia. I mean, I know it's a little bit of guesswork, but your instincts about what's going on in the state. I mean, is it just keep growing out from Metro Atlanta and become more Democratic, or is there a spot where it'll just stop?
You know, I think we're going to start to see a change in demographics in these suburbs as we decide how close people need to be to Atlanta to be employed in Atlanta. We've had a number of people moving out of state into the state to work in Atlanta. And it used to be, what was the drive that you could reasonably do either from Alpharetta or from just north of that? Now, as people are able to work from home, I think we may actually start to see some meaningful demographic change in those exurban counties that the housing is even more affordable. They're even bigger houses. Those school districts are still quite strong. And so I think you'll see an attraction for those exurban counties that really had a cap on their appeal because of the commute into Atlanta on a daily basis. If there's not a daily basis commute that people have to engage in to get to Atlanta and still work in Atlanta and be employed by a corporation headquartered in Atlanta, I think we may start to see those demographic changes moving into Cherokee County and Forsyth County. I think those will certainly be where we'll see those changes really make the difference.
Okay. We have another question from subscribers. It's more about the election. And we have a subscriber from Roswell who wants to know if Georgia House Republicans survived because of split tickets, or was it that Biden voters just skipped the down ballot races? So this is a question that's specifically about the legislature and those House Republicans. So some questions: split tickets, or were Biden voters just uninterested in the down ballot races?
I think it's more of the latter. I think it's a lot of Biden voters didn't vote all the way down. We saw a lot of hold in the Republican side, especially with David Perdue. David Perdue actually outdid Trump by a few hundred votes. He is the he is the highest vote getter among Republicans in state history. David Perdue is, which is an interesting fact. Even though he didn't win the election outright, he's forced into a runoff. But I think you saw a lot of bleed down the ballot for Democrats who backed Joe Biden but didn't vote down ballot for other Democrats. And John Ossoff's a perfect example. I think he underperformed Joe Biden by about 100,000 votes or so, which is the reason we're here right now with two runoffs. Because if he had matched Joe Biden's support, he would be at least very close. He'd be right on the edge of winning that race outright.
And that's an important observation, because usually Democrats are much better about voting all the way down to the ballot, and it's the Republicans who kind of stick to the national races and then walk away from it.
Okay. All right. Well, we've got one from Facebook, and Don Alton has a couple of questions, but we'll.
Hey, Don.
So he would like to know about Biden's victory in Georgia. So Biden's apparent victory in Georgia, what does that mean for 2022? So he's looking.
Yeah, let's. Tia, why don't you take that one? What do you think it means for 2022?
Tia, I think you're on mute.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Here now. I think Democrats are going to be fired up in 2022 to find the right candidate. We all suspect that candidate is likely to be Stacey Abrams once again. But, now that Joe Biden has apparently won in Georgia, we don't think that's going to change. Now there is a blueprint for a Democrat to win statewide in Georgia. We know the demographics are only going to change further in Democrats' favor over the next 2 years is what we suspect. And so it's just going to be even more ripe for a Democrat, again, the right candidate. And but I think Stacey Abrams thinks she's the right candidate, and we know that she came pretty close 2 years ago. So I don't see why she wouldn't give it another chance. And again, now that Stacey Abrams, her profile is so big, not just in Georgia, but nationwide, she's going to be able to raise a lot of money. She's going to be able to get a lot of attention and enthusiasm. And I think Democrats think they can win the governor's office in 2 years.
Okay. All right. Well, one last question. This also coming from Facebook, and this one is really about a taxpayer question. And they would like to know: are we estimating or trying to gather the costs of the recount and the lawsuits that are challenging the election? So, any idea of costs to defend lawsuits and also to recount votes?
Mark, that's one you've been, I think, preparing for some time as you've tracked this. What do you think those costs will look like if you had to estimate?
Sure, easily hundreds of thousands of dollars for the recount, and that cost will be primarily borne by county taxpayers. It's the counties that do the ballot counting, and they're the ones who had to hire poll workers and election workers to count these ballots one at a time through this hand recount. The Secretary of State's office has said they are trying to find some federal election funding that could help offset some of the costs that counties are paying. But for now, I think it's fair to expect that county taxpayers are paying for this recount. And as I said before, $180,000 in DeKalb County alone. Most other counties haven't even begun to estimate the cost. But I think easily, we're talking several hundred thousand, if not millions. And then as for the lawsuits, the ultimate cost of that, the Attorney General's office generally hires outside attorneys to represent the Secretary of State's office in lawsuits. And as of a couple of months ago, the cost of that was well over, if I recall correctly, $3 million. I think that's probably on the low end. Some of these lawsuits have been going on for years, and they will continue to be litigated. We have the lawsuit over Georgia's voting system and its security, and we also have a big lawsuit that was filed after the 2018 election by Fair Fight Action, contesting Georgia's voting system and a number of ways that Fair Fight, which was founded by Stacey Abrams, argues that voters aren't fully embraced by our political and legal and elections system. So these cases will continue on into the future as Georgia is a battleground both in the courts and in the ballot box.
Okay. Thanks, Mark. And this is the final question, and it's probably an amalgam of several questions that are being asked by folks on Facebook. And it's directed at probably you best, Kevin, to answer this. And it's really about media and this age of facts being challenged and folks who are trying to be armed with facts and having conversations with friends and colleagues about what's going on. So the question is, one, how's the AJC going to cover the rest of this race where disinformation is probably likely going to be an issue? And two, any good advice on how folks can source themselves beyond the AJC to make sure that they're informed about their vote?
You know, I've had a lot of friends ask me this question, and I actually gave a speech last week where it came up as well. And I've developed a sort of a simple answer, which is put down your social media feed and read a newspaper and find out what the facts are. You know, we always say it's worth knowing what's really going on, and we talk about that a lot. But I encourage people to make sure that their media diet is a healthy one. And if you're only going to one source all the time, ask yourself if it wouldn't be better to go to more. But I think, as you've heard from our journalists tonight, I can assure you they worked very, very hard to find out what the facts are and where the facts lead. Certainly, Mark Nisi is probably as expert in the issues of Georgia voting as anyone in the state, and you've heard from the rest of our folks. And I think we are fine with people asking us how we've discovered something or how we know something. We try to be as transparent as possible about where our information comes from. So I would encourage you to stick with us and find other sources as well. Don't isolate or narrow your media diet, broaden it during these times. All right, I've got to get to this part because we're running out of time. We have a really important announcement, and I'm going to turn to Jim Galloway for that announcement and let him take it away. So, Jim.
All right. Okay. I've lived in Metro Atlanta pretty much all of my life. And I grabbed the first opportunity I could to start here at this newspaper on May 21st, 1979. My last day at the AJC will be January 15th, 2021. For those of you without a calculator, that's 41 years and change. It's been an honor to have had such an important front row seat to bear witness to all the change that has come to Georgia, the rest of the South, and the farthest corners of this nation over the last 5 decades. Let me first give thanks to Judy. It's my wife of 43 years. She is actually my longest relationship of choice. Nonstop hours and long periods away from home are something that every spouse of a journalist endures, and she's had her share. I'd also like to thank the readers who have been so essential to me. I've had email and telephone relationships with many of you that stretch back decades, and that has been incredibly rewarding. The last 20 years or so have been difficult for the newspaper industry, and I'm fortunate that the Journal-Constitution has been such a stable harbor for journalism. To be able to retire on my own say-so, my own schedule, this is not an opportunity that many journalists get to have anymore, and I'm grateful to editors like you, Kevin, who have kept the ship so steady that I can simply stroll down the gangplank. I would also like to note that I would not be leaving if I didn't have the highest confidence in my AJC colleagues, particularly those who have labored so hard at the state capitol. Politics is not going to get any easier. It's going to get louder. Yet the people I'm leaving behind have already proven they can handle what lies ahead. I'm not gone yet, and I'm not dying, and there's work to be done for the next several weeks. So I'm going to be back writing the Jolt tomorrow morning, and I hope you'll be reading it.
Jim, thank you. Of course, I had a little heads up, and I have tried to talk you out of this, but I understand it's time. And let me just say in a very personal way, thank you. Thank you for all that you've done for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, for those of us who work with you. And as editor of the newspaper, you have been an invaluable advisor, supporter. I've many times run a column past you where you've kept me from making maybe a mistake. And everyone in this newsroom loves to come and ask your advice and get your take on things. And we wish you well, and we will miss you greatly.
Thank you very much.
Well, thanks, everybody. We offer this event today as a public service, and we owe a special thanks to our subscribers. Because of your support, we're able to make this benefit open to everyone in our community. Our reporting and local journalism is because of subscriber support. If you're not a subscriber, join us. Go to ajc.com/worthknowing and sign up today. Thank you. And I hope you'll continue to follow our reporting in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and at ajc.com. Thank you and have a good night.